So at this time, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our guest speakers for the Flipping Stigma, from the Flipping Stigma research team, Jim Mann and Mariko Sakamoto. So Jim is the co-lead on the Flipping Stigma research team, who also lives with dementia. He has been a valuable leader and partner in much of the work at the Alzheimer's Society of BC, both behind the scenes, serving on our board of directors, as well as contributing his expert knowledge and lived experience to numerous projects. Jim keeps very busy, as well as being in the public eye. So Jim shares his personal story to break down stigma and inspire others to take action. So the University of British Columbia recently recognized Jim as the most influential person in Canada in countering stereotypes and building a more inclusive society for people living with dementia, awarding him an honorary Doctor of Laws degree. So welcome, Jim, if you would like to give everyone a wave. Thank you so much for being here today. And then Mariko is a nurse researcher with over 20 years of nursing experience specializing in community health. She is currently the president-elect for the Gerontological Nurses Association of British Columbia and an assistant professor at the School of Nursing at the University of Victoria. Mariko was a postdoctoral fellow with the Center for Research on Personhood and Dementia at the University of British Columbia, a recipient of the postdoctoral award from the Alzheimer's Society of Canada's research program for her work around dementia-friendly communities, and is a proud member of the Flipping Stigma research team. So welcome, Mariko. Just a very warm welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us today to have this really important discussion. All right, so I'm just going to start by talking a little bit about the webinar series. So this webinar is part one of a four-part Flipping Stigma webinar series. So the team members of the Flipping Stigma on its Ear Toolkit project, including action group members who live with dementia and researchers, will be invited to each webinar to help us explore the toolkit, as well as share their stories and personal experiences. And I do believe that we have a few of the action group members also joining us in the audience today. Lester and Cindy, we saw you say hi in the chat. If anyone else is joining us, please do feel welcome to say hi in the chat box, and we hope to see more of you in our future webinars. So the aim of this series is to educate and raise awareness about dementia for changes in attitude, assumptions, and to take action. So we do encourage you to visit the Flipping Stigma page on the Society's website for more information on the upcoming sessions. So these will be quarterly sessions, so they will be coming throughout the year. And you can learn more at alzbc.org/flippingstigma. But we've also included that link on the helpful resources document, which will be provided in the chat box. So you can check that out. All right, so in BC, 85,000 individuals have been diagnosed with some form of dementia. So a diagnosis of dementia can increase a person's sense of vulnerability. Not only are people faced with cognitive changes, but too often, many also face needless stigma and discrimination that can make their experience worse. So as such, the discrimination caused by stigma that accompanies a diagnosis of dementia really does need to be flipped on its ear. And that Flipping Stigma Toolkit really was designed just to do that. So on the screen, you can actually see a screenshot of what the toolkit's homepage looks like. And we will actually visit that homepage a little bit later on in the webinar. But just so you're aware, the purpose of this toolkit is to recognize and respond to stigma and discrimination. It has been designed by people living with dementia to help others, including other people living with dementia, the people who support them, and those who do research. So it is to address the challenges around stigma and dementia. So all of the information provided in this toolkit is from the perspective of people living with dementia. And there's actually a wonderful tutorial video that you can watch on YouTube that will assist you in navigating the online toolkit. I found it very helpful myself, and so I do highly recommend checking it out just to ensure that you don't miss any of the important features that the toolkit has to offer, because there's a lot of information on there and all of it is really great. So the link to that video tutorial is also available on the helpful resources document. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so that I can invite our guest panelists to speak a little bit more about the Flipping Stigma project. Okay, perfect. And Jim, I'd like to direct the first question to you, if you don't mind, and just ask you if you can tell us a little bit about the initial research that led to the creation of the action group.
Sure. Thank you, Kim. Um, the the research had a few attempts a few years ago for funding, but 4 years ago they got Canadian of Institutes of Health Research grant to uh, to do a participatory action research, and that was to work with a group of people, dementia, and to address stigma, address initially the citizenship for people with dementia in the community, and so in excuse me, in the mid 2019, I think June was our first meeting, and it was face to face, and we started with a few members and gradually had a few more members, and then the pandemic came along and everything else was on Zoom, and we have uh, active action group of people worked on this project, and I'm sure we'll get into it a little bit later.
Thank you so much, Jim, for telling us a little bit how it all got
But
started.
I think it's important, though, um, to say that there were a couple of attempts by the researchers to Alison Finney and Deb O'Connor for funding, but they were not successful, and would, massage the project. But they invited me to become a part of the application process, and we worked on the vision for the project, and we were very fortunate to get it funded.
Thank you. So it sounds like it really started to progress when you brought on people with lived experience,
Yeah.
which is great to hear.
Yes.
And do you mind sharing a little bit about how the action group came to decide on creating an online toolkit? How did you decide that was the right fit?
Well, I think it was through discussion. It was through talking about the what was when the application went into the CIHR, and so there was discussion about it, and what do members see as the some action items, some correction, if you will, in the community. And they talked about some of the experiences, and uh, talked about how they might address what they were talking about, the issue of stigma, and how it would be best addressed for others, not for their benefit, but for the benefit of the wider community, whether it's in BC or beyond. And I think it's fair to say they came to the realization that the best way to spread the knowledge is online, and so they said we should be working on something online, and it worked out to be the toolkit, and it was a challenge to create the toolkit because you're by this point you're doing all of it online and trying to take what's on a screen, and sometimes there'd be something mailed to the members, but then you're only taking it from 8.5 by 11 piece of paper and trying to imagine what it would look like on a computer screen. And so it really was a challenge for all of us to interpret, but it really was felt to be the right message or the right medium to communicate the message. And I think it has been a big success. They've done it the way the research was done in the action group, how they put it together.
Yeah, I have to say, despite some of the barriers that you guys overcame and doing this all during COVID as well, the finished product is absolutely amazing, very impressive, and I think something that I strongly encourage everybody to check out following this webinar. And speaking of like online and accessibility, Rico, what kind of reach has the toolkit had since it was created?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that. I just want to check that you can hear me okay.
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, we've had amazing reach, much to the delight of all of us who are on the team, which of course includes the action group members. So we work with a really great web designer. Her name is Samantha Pineda, and she very kindly looks up the toolkit analytics. When I got involved in this project, I didn't know a lot about web design, but it turns out, and somebody of you may know this, you can track visits to your website. So Sam provides us with regular updates. And what we've learned since this toolkit came online in September 2021, so just about shy of 2 years, is that we've had well over 7,000 unique visitors to our site, which is actually pretty amazing when you think about that this is a grassroots project, that we put this toolkit online, and over time people are finding it and people are using it. And a really neat thing is that folks aren't just coming from across the country, from across Canada, to check out this toolkit and the work of the action group, but we've had visitors from the US, from Europe, Australia, Mexico, for example, different parts of Asia. So I would say there has been really global outreach in terms of being able to get this toolkit onto the computers of folks all over the world. And what we've also found is that people are using it or are on the site for a fair amount of time. On average, Sam has been able to tell us, for about 14 minutes. And so what we've learned is that's actually quite a long time. Most people will visit a website for a couple minutes at most. So people are really spending time going through the toolkit and looking through it. And one more thing I might want to add in terms of the reach of this toolkit is that it's actually been accepted by the World Health Organization's Global Dementia Observatory Knowledge Platform. So that's a really long title, but basically the WHO has their own website where they have peer-reviewed different types of resources for people living with dementia, and the Action Group's toolkit has been accepted, and we're actually getting a lot of traffic through that website. So we're really pleased and excited by the reach of this toolkit. So thanks for asking that question, because we really like to promote it. And I also want to say I'm seeing almost 80 people on this call, so we're just really excited that we're getting this kind of reach as well. People are interested in hearing about the work of the action group and the toolkit. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a very impressive accomplishment to have that reach. And like you said, not only within Canada, but globally. So think of all the lives that you're impacting. It's great to see that. And I actually wanted to, at the beginning, to ask the audience if you were familiar with the Flipping Stigma Toolkit. And so while we're speaking, if you don't mind popping into the chat, if you were aware and if you've utilized the toolkit prior to the webinar, or if you will be first-time users, because that's great information for us to have. All right. So before we talk a bit more about recognizing and responding to stigma and discrimination, I'd like to take a moment to talk kind of about what do those terms mean. So Mariko, I'd like to ask you, what have you learned about stigma and discrimination from being part of this project? I believe there was some definitions that were created by the action group members.
Yeah, thanks for asking, Kim. Well, this whole process has been really interesting for me as a nurse who felt like, having had a lot of nursing experience and worked with, all kinds of different people over my career, that I might have a good idea of stigma. But certainly I did not when it comes to the experience of living with dementia. And what's really special about the toolkit is that there are definitions of what it means to experience stigma and discrimination. And those definitions actually were developed by action group members, so the people who are part of this project and people with real lived experience of dementia and of experiencing stigma and discrimination. So I thought maybe I could just give a quick overview of what those definitions were, because this was a really important learning experience for me as someone who doesn't have that lived experience. And so what I learned was that for folks living with dementia, stigma can happen when other people are making assumptions about them based on their diagnosis and their actions, or maybe their appearance. And it becomes especially compounded and powerful when that diagnosis becomes known. And folks can make assumptions about the person living with dementia based on that diagnosis itself. Oh, you have dementia. Okay, this is what I think this means, and making all kinds of what could be negative assumptions. And what that can lead to is discrimination, which means that based on those assumptions that someone has kind of internalized, they can act in certain ways or say certain things that can make the person living with dementia feel perhaps incapable, or feel judged, or feel like they're deficient in some way, which they certainly are not, but that's what can happen. And so that was a really important learning experience for me to really come get to understand what those terms actually mean from folks with lived experience. And for those of you who do get a chance to look at the toolkit, or maybe have already done that, you'll see those definitions very clearly written out in one of the early pages of the toolkit.
Thank you for that. I know I found the definitions incredibly helpful myself, so thank you. And Jim, I wanted to ask you, what do you think causes stigma and discrimination, or what is underlying it?
I think that there are a lot of causes of it, and one of them, I guess, to be general, is ageism. Has been written about a fair bit, I think, recently, but a whole misunderstanding around dementia and people living with dementia. I remember talking to a longtime researcher, and I said, there seems to be the assumption that people go from the diagnosis and immediately go into long-term care. No thought given that there's a journey involved of however many years. And after a moment, she looked at me and she says, I do that. And so there's that, I think, causes a lot of the stigma, because in people's minds, and we see it repeated in media, is the person who is very elderly, very frail, and maybe unable to communicate, and that isn't who so many people are with dementia. I was I've been fortunate. I was diagnosed in 2007, and so for a lot of people, it's what I call unconscious bias. It's firmly ensconced at the back of everybody's mind that it just pops into your mind, unconsciously, that we have that is your go-to for a person with dementia. I know I've talked to people who, have, excuse me, adult children, and they're sitting in the living room, and all of a sudden they realize that everybody's talking, but they're talking around him. They're not including him in the conversation. A person I know was a longtime member of a golf club, and he knew all the rules and organized men's night. But the day after, basically 12 hours after they had learned he had dementia, they said, "Oh, don't worry, we'll organize men's night for you." And no one ever went to him but a rule. So it's that assumption that the action group is trying to address. It's that stigma. Automatically, you have dementia, so we'll do it for you. You are incapable. And that's what the action group, I think, has been very successful at addressing with their toolkit.
Thank you so much, Jim. I think it's so important to point out that it's not often done with intent, but it is that unconscious bias, as you say. And so much of us can learn how to shift the way we think about people living with dementia and what they're capable of. So thank you for sharing that. All right, so we're now going to share some examples of stigma and discrimination that the action group members have experienced in their day-to-day lives. And for those listening, you may relate to these experiences yourself, or you may have your own examples, and you feel very welcome to put them into the chat box if you'd like to. And it's really helpful to know how to recognize and name stigma and discrimination so that we can take action against it or make changes in the way that we interact with others in our life. So before we share the audio clips, I just want to note that these audio clips are unscripted conversations of people living with dementia. They are speaking in the moment within the action group meetings. And so there is sometimes a little bit of background noise because they were calling in from their homes. And many of the meetings did happen during COVID where everything was online. And so I'm just going to take a moment to pull up the website, and we will share some audio clips directly from the toolkit. So just to help people navigate here on their own, if you just go to the toolbar here, it is under Recognizing Stigma, and what pops up are stories from the action group. And you will see that there's 5 different examples. Today, we're just going to play 2 of those examples. And then again, we encourage you to go check out the toolkit if you haven't had an opportunity to do so yet, and listen to the others. Before I play the first clip, I would like you to, as you're listening, just think about what gets stirred up for you. Are there feelings that come up? Are there maybe situations that you've experienced yourself? Can you resonate to these examples? And we'd just love to hear your thoughts in the chat box, and we'll share some of them with the audience. So if you're comfortable, please do share what comes up for you. So we're going to share example number 2, which is when somebody feels that they are being treated as incapable. And hopefully we will have sound. If there's any sound issues, please let me know.
I had a chance to go out to the Lonsdale Key yesterday. It was a beautiful day, and there was a lady in the group. She knows that I've got Alzheimer's, and she was worried that I had gone off on my own. And she asked with sort of a surprise. She said, "You mean you went by yourself?" And I said that I did. She couldn't believe. I think it's often assumed that because someone has dementia that they're suddenly incapable of being independent and going to do things of their own. dementia or Alzheimer's, persons don't know that dementia can last 8, 9, 10 years.
Okay. Thank you. So again, if anything got stirred up for you or any thoughts came up while you were listening to that, please do put them in the chat box. And we're going to now listen to example number 5, feeling disrespected by the medical community.
Has anybody had experiences where you felt like your rights were not being respected because of the diagnosis of some sort of a dementia?
I always have to go back to the medical profession.
Yes. Okay.
That's the only place I have ever felt
Yeah.
discriminated against.
A couple of comments. So about a year ago, my wife and I were seeing our GP, and he made the comment during our conversation, well, you're losing some of your marbles, but we'll try and keep as many as we can.
Oh my
With
God.
a smile, and I'm usually a calm person, but I had to think this is probably not quite an appropriate one. I let it pass. I figured we're in the hole already. Don't dig deeper.
Okay. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, and then Lori, I'd love to hear what's been shared in the chat box.
Yeah. One of the things that's come up that I think is very exciting is almost everyone has said that they didn't know about flippingstigma.com. And people are very enthusiastic to say, well, I didn't know about it, but I'm going to go check it out, or that they're first time user, or so that's very exciting. We've got a good group of new people here. But in terms of sharing stories, Ellen shared some of the care aides at her mother's care home made gestures circling a finger to indicate that my mother wasn't all there. It was derogatory. The workers who were feeding my mother in particular would do this. And what I really appreciated is another participant said, suggested that maybe she could send an email with explaining this had happened to the manager of the care home and include the Flipping Stigma web link, which I thought was really smart. Tobias shared that as a caregiver, he's feeling that he may be an inadvertent stigmatizer. And I thought that was really brave to share. Stigma is precisely why my husband doesn't want to share this new diagnosis with our friends and family. And Shelley says, when a patient in acute care reports a patient has dementia, the care team will often not speak with the patient and go directly to the family or the next of kin for any information and planning.
Yeah.
So powerful. Yeah. So
Oh,
that's
yes.
so really honest, wonderful stuff in the chat.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And Tobias, don't feel alone, because I think when we know better, we do better. And that's what education is, why it's so important to provide this type of education, and why we're so happy to have the Flipping Stigma team here to do a series of webinars with us, because I think we all have so much to learn around this topic. And thank you for all those touching stories. Okay, and Jim, you had shared when we were planning for this webinar how stigma and discrimination has played a role in your life, particularly a story around it, how it impacted your mom. Would you mind sharing that with us?
Sure. I my mother was a widower, and after a few years moved from her condo into independent living. And it was there that I really saw the stigma of dementia. It was amazing to me when you've got mostly women and in an apartment building, if you will, and I was there for lunch one day, and we were waiting to go in, and I could see a couple of ladies looking over at us, and I thought, you're not talking about me, and I thought, what has my mother done now? And then on another day, I was on my way back home and stopped in at the end, what would have been the end of their lunch period. And they always sat at the same table with the same group of people. And I went to what was her table, and she wasn't there. There were four people there. And so I was wondering what had happened, and so said, where's my mother? And they pointed over to a corner table and said, oh, she has been moved to another table. And I realized that they, I guess, got fed up with hearing the same story or being asked the same question or whatever. But there was that uh, lack of empathy. One woman, when my mother was thinking that maybe they could go down to meals together because they lived next door to each other, she said, I didn't move in here to be somebody's caregiver. And so it all, in my mind, represented stigma. And that knowledge vacancy, if you will, of again, that journey, but and the patience. You do need a little bit of patience, but unfortunately, people don't have a lot sometimes, and I think it showed in her examples.
Yeah, and it's a powerful example of how it can lead to social isolation and people being excluded. And I think that's a real concern for so many of us.
That's right, because was it somebody I talked to or something I read that after a while they started just saying, I'll just have my meal in their suite. They just weren't going to put themselves through that. So, I mean, if my mother had been there longer, I think I would have been inclined to, let's get everybody together and let's talk about it. But yeah. I hadn't been diagnosed at that point, so I wasn't quite in that mindset.
But those experiences have really pushed you to be this amazing advocate that you are today. And I think that without those, we wouldn't have learned so much, because you share your story so beautifully. So thank you.
Well, I'm fortunate to combine my mother's experiences and now my own, but with what I did in business as far as being a communicator and an advocate. So I'm more comfortable doing it. So it's given me a purpose too.
Thank you. It's important work. And so now that we've kind of shared a few examples of how stigma and discrimination can impact individuals living with dementia, we're going to talk a little bit about responding. So the first step in responding to stigma is recognizing when an interaction is making you feel inadequate in some way, and then naming it as stigma. So it helps us to recognize that it is the other person's attitudes and or actions or loss of patience, in Jim's example too, or just lack of education around dementia that is the problem, and not something that that you have done personally. It's not personal. And I think that's an important message. And so how you respond is up to you. And some people find that it can be a little bit intimidating to speak out, but others feel that is their responsibility to say something and that these can be valuable moments for making change. And so just know that there's no one right way to go about responding to stigma. And I want you to know that the toolkit does have an entire section on this with tips and strategies for responding. Most of which we won't be able to get into in this webinar. We will explore a little bit further in future webinars, but just so you know that those resources are there. But sometimes speaking out does not need to be explicitly saying something. So there's a few things that you can consider before speaking out. Is this an opportunity for a teachable moment? What will you gain by saying something? And then what might you lose by saying something? So really kind of gauging how it may impact you personally. And Jim, I want to call on you again because you have spoken very profoundly about teachable moments in the past, and you had a great example that you shared. If you don't mind telling us a little bit about teachable moments.
Sure.
Thank you.
It is hard for some people to take advantage of teachable moments, to take a step back and say, what you just said, or I'm being excluded. But sometimes it's more a case of having a conversation with somebody who doesn't necessarily understand everything that is beneficial in talking to people with dementia. And one day, the CEO of the Alzheimer's Society of BC and I were on a radio talk show. It was a number of years, still good. And we're talking about dementia and living with dementia. And he asked me a question. And after he had asked that question, continued to talk about the situation or expand on that question. And then when he had finished that, he then looked at me to begin answering the question. So I actually looked back at him and said, unfortunately, I'm not able to answer your question because I don't remember it. Because after you asked the question, you did continue talking and now it's gone. So that to me was a teachable moment. And I felt really good about it, actually, because it was a teachable moment for one individual, the person with whom I was speaking. But Bill Goodshow had a lot of listeners. And I really thought in my heart that there would be some people that would be going, oh, wow, I do that. Or I have done that. But I do that. And so hopefully people can learn. And that's why I guess I call them teachable moments. I say I believe in the 6 degrees of separation, that when you do tell somebody something or correct somebody, they may pass that on to other people. And so in some of my presentations, I often think that maybe I haven't just spoken to the number of people in the room. It goes beyond that. So it's worth doing if you can.
Absolutely. I don't think we should ever underestimate the ripple effect of those teachable moments, because even if you're speaking to one person and it shapes and changes the way that they interact with the next individual, it can have a profound effect over time. So thank you for sharing that. And before we move on to any questions that people may have for Jim and Mariko, I'd like to ask a question to you, Mariko. This has come up. It came up in the comments, and it came up in the example that we saw around situations with healthcare providers. And so many people have experienced, once they've been diagnosed with dementia, that a healthcare provider may speak about them to their family as if they weren't in the room, even when the person is very capable of making decisions regarding their personal health. And so, from your perspective as a healthcare provider, Mariko, what can people do in those situations? Could those be teachable moments as well?
Yes, absolutely. And you know, I love this idea of the ripple effect of teachable moments, and also this idea that it goes both ways. There are plenty of teachable moments in the toolkit. There's actually a whole section on tips for healthcare providers that were developed by the action group members as, you know, basically as teachable moments for us to all learn. You know, certainly for me as a healthcare provider and a nurse who's been in practice for many years, it's so important to remember to talk to the person and not to the, you know, the caregiver or the spouse. And you're absolutely right. I did see that comment in the chat, and you know, when we've had our action group meetings, members have shared that experience of really being depersonalized by a healthcare provider who just won't talk to them. So those are important moments to learn from, just in reflecting, like, you know, I especially since coming on this project, I look back in my practice and think about times when I might have made assumptions or inadvertently stigmatized or discriminated against someone. I know there was that comment from Tobias in the chat about inadvertent stigmatizing, and we're all human and can do things like that without meaning to. But this is the beauty of the toolkit, is that it provides many, many moments to learn from, especially for people who work in healthcare, where unfortunately there is a lot of stigma and discrimination. So, so if anyone here wants to share some information with your healthcare providers, I believe the tips in the toolkit can be printed out. You can share that with your doctors and your nurses, or if you are a healthcare provider or a caregiver, check out those tips as well, so that you know, future moments we can do better.
Absolutely. I think that will be a very handy printout to have and to share. I know at many of our workshops, we could definitely utilize that, because I think that question comes up quite a bit, something that a lot of people face. So thank you.
Yeah.
And one strategy I have heard shared that has been effective from a care partner is when the healthcare provider was directing it at them, they just reminded them that they were their backup eyes and ears. And they were there to make sure that all the information was recorded and retained, but please to address their partner, the individual living with dementia. And so the care partner can also have these teachable moments too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I
and
remember being in a conversation once, and I felt like I was watching a tennis game. I was going back and forth and back and forth, and it was about me. So it was corrected very quickly. So
yeah.
I was also going to say that it's okay to remind your healthcare providers who they're there to serve. It can be really hard to do that, and that's why in the toolkit we do say, you know, only speak out if you feel comfortable doing that, because certainly there can be times where, you know, you might not feel comfortable, especially if it's your specialist or a healthcare provider you don't really know. But from someone who works on the other end, you know, we're there to learn. I'm not sure. Can you, it just says my call was disconnected. Can you still hear me?
We can hear you, but your video appears to be frozen, but we can hear you.
All right.
Okay, so just we have just over 10 minutes left, and wondering, have any questions or comments come up, Lori, that you'd like to share with Jim and Mariko?
couple of things. Maureen says that she has had to be an advocate for her husband in a social setting to explain his dementia. She says he has more than one problem beside dementia, but she says, I speak to these people with saying, I feel what you feel. Just again, that deep empathy. And her experience is just what you said, Kim. When they know better, they do better. So once they know that she's aware, Maureen says they're very kind. Fiona reacted quite strongly, Jim, to your story of your mom and said that's so heartbreaking, kind of like the isolation and exclusion that children impose on each other in the schoolyard. So sad that it doesn't change as we age.
Yeah.
Oh, very good question. At what point in the dementia journey should the healthcare provider focus their comments on the caregiver or to the caregiver?
That is a good question. I don't know, Mariko, do you have any experience with that? I can speak very briefly that we have heard from families that some care providers take the opportunity to find a moment for maybe the nurse, the registered nurse there, or the social worker to have a conversation and to share some knowledge or to talk with the person living with dementia so that maybe the neurologist can have some alone time with the care partner if there is something that needs to be shared. And we're at a point where maybe the person is not able to make those decisions on their own behalf. But I think in most cases, it's nice to not speak over the individuals if they're not in the room. Because Jim, as you just expressed, when you're having that moment, even if the person's not picking up on everything that's being said, they're aware that they're being talked about. So looking for opportunities where maybe there can be private conversations. And some clinics do that really well. And sorry, Mariko, anything that you could add to that or anything that you've heard?
Yeah, I'm just watching the chat because lots of comments are coming in from that. Great question. Thanks for that, Cindy.
Good.
And again, apologies, my cell phone is no longer working. I've had a bunch of technical difficulties, but you can hear me, so that's good.
You can.
That's such a good question, Cindy. I think, from a healthcare perspective and from myself as a nurse, I always do my best to talk to the person regardless as to the stage of their dementia. But I do understand that that's easier said than done, especially if the conversation, if you're needing to impart specific knowledge. I think it has to be a fine balance. And I think if you're always acknowledging there's a person there that, maybe they're having trouble understanding or may not understand what but regardless, you must do what you can as the healthcare providers to acknowledge that person, involve them in the discussion. And for me as a nurse, when I've worked with people with really advanced dementia, I always ask permission. I always say who I am. I always explain that I'm going to talk to your daughter for a few moments. I hope that's okay. So making those kind of efforts is really important. But I do know that it is so much more complicated than that. And I don't know, Jim, if you have any insights that you'd want to share.
The question?
Well, we're talking about, yeah, no worries. And there's lots of things that are coming up in the chat, like I mentioned, with Cindy's question about when is it appropriate or when is the best time to talk to the healthcare provider as opposed to involving the person with lived experience. And my take is that it really is a fine balance, and it's of working with the person you're, whether it's your spouse, a family member, a friend that you're helping out. And I was just kind of giving my perspective as a healthcare provider, but I know it can be really different from the other side.
Well, it can, and what I've suggested to some, and in fact, I was in Uber the other day and suggested it to the Uber driver, but is to write down why the appointment. What is the reason you're going to see the doctor? What are some of the issues that have precipitated this visit, for example. And if they're written down, number one, you can put it on the desk and say, this is why we're here, because we only have 10 or 15 minutes, and let's focus the conversation type of thing. But that said, it also, I think, would help the person living with dementia in their focus for the discussion. And then in some ways it's going to be play it by ear. I'm because for in some instances you don't want to make the assumption that I should fill in the blanks, when in fact the family member, perhaps with dementia, is sitting there and thinking I'm in control. I'm able to explain it. I mean, Ellen just said, my mother's doctor rolled her eyes. I can't read the whole thing, but anyway, but in fact, that's what you might get from the individual living with dementia. Oh my God, like they're doing it again, taking over. It is a sensitive issue. I don't think you can get away. There's no other way of saying it. I mean, it's. I can imagine some people would say, "You're not going to go in the doctor's office anymore with me." So, in which case, then the caregiver might well say, "You know what? The next appointment, I will arrange to have the following appointment, so that you can sit in this room and I will have my appointment with the doctor, and he can brief me, or they can brief me." It is sensitive. And I guess it's just something you have to go in knowing that there's no one size fits all on that one.
Yeah, everybody is different and has different relationships with their family members,
Yeah.
and their healthcare providers. So it can really vary. It definitely is a key situation.
Yeah.
Just sorry, but an addendum here, that some of it you're hoping that the doctor will initiate the conversation with the patient, and not start off on the wrong foot, because that will influence perhaps that whole interaction negatively. So you hope that will happen. And again, because there's only 10 or 15, whatever it is, minutes, then the family member might well have to, sort of, well, we're running out of time, so let me summarize it for the doctor. And that may help as well.
Thank you, Jim. It's a really challenging one to answer, and like you said, it's finding that fine balance of respecting the person living with dementia's dignity, and their right to make decisions about their own health care and personal care, but also knowing that sometimes the disease does rob people of their awareness, and so sometimes we do have to have the care partner bring in information. And how do we do that in the most respectful way possible, and hoping that your healthcare provider initiates a way to do that as well. And it also makes me think about the importance of having those conversations early on, while the person is able to fully participate and tell you about their wants for later in life. So lots of things going on with that one. But with just a few minutes left, I am going to bring up our closing slide, and there is an opportunity that I want to quickly share with the audience. So bear with me for 1 second while that loads.
And just while you're loading, just Mariko, maybe very quickly you could just answer. Annette asks, does the toolkit include practical guidelines on how carers can redirect doctors' questions to their loved one with dementia, or on shared decision making? So practical guidelines on shared decision making.
Oh, thanks, Lori.
Oh, I see you answered it.
I just put a little thing in the chat. I don't know if that link would work, but that's the link to the PDF I was talking about, that can be shared with healthcare providers. But that's a great question, Annette, especially when it comes to shared decision making. It's not that specific. It's more just general tips on how healthcare providers like doctors can communicate more effectively, can interact in less stigmatizing ways. But we're always open to new ideas. So thank you for that comment.
Thank you. So I think today's topic highlights the importance of dementia education and the impact that education can have around reducing stigma, and blends nicely into this opportunity where the society is really intending on increasing our accessibility to education by acquiring a learning management system, or an LMS. And so that is a software that would allow people living with dementia, caregivers, volunteers, healthcare providers, community organizations, anyone to access really engaging dementia education that's online whenever it is convenient for them. So it can be like self-paced modules. And so this may be really important for people that, for whatever reason, may have mobility issues, or just there's maybe not in-person education provided in their community. And so just wanting to increase the accessibility that we have around our online education. And with this, we can have education that includes videos, learning quizzes, discussion boards, all downloadable resources, all these wonderful tools. And so having said that, we really want to make sure that we pick the best system possible and that it is the most user-friendly system. And so we're asking for help, and we're looking for people. And in particular, we would love people with lived experience. So if you're a care partner or a person living with dementia, to trial some of the software that we have picked and go through a few modules and test it for us and provide some feedback. So if you're interested, you'll be provided with all the instructions on how to do that, sent the module demos, and then you'll have an opportunity to provide feedback. And it will take approximately 2 hours to participate in that. And so if anybody on the call today is interested, please do reach out to Dorothy. And that brings us to the end of today's webinar. Again, thank you to our speakers, Mariko and Jim, and for all of you for tuning in and providing such wonderful feedback and comments in the chat box. We always love to hear your input. So if you don't mind taking a moment to fill out the evaluation survey following this webinar, that would be greatly appreciated. We know you hear about the survey a lot at the end of each one, but we really do look at that feedback, and it shapes the way that we present material and the type of topics that we bring to you. So it is very important. So we would love if you could do that. And then if you have any questions that came up about your personal situation, about this topic, or any other questions about dementia, please always feel welcome to call the First Link Dementia Helpline. If you're interested in registering for a program like one of our support groups or Minds in Motion, this is the best way to go about doing that. And so the number is there on your screen. We have the English Dementia Helpline available Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m., as well as service in Punjabi, Cantonese, and Mandarin Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. So thank you all so very much for joining us. And please look out for the next webinar in this series. It is coming up on Wednesday, September 20th. And this is where we actually get to see more about the action group members behind the project, hear about their stories, and there's some beautiful videos that will show about their lives. So we hope that you'll tune in to our next session. Thank you so much.